My name is Christina Fuller-Gregory, and I am joined today by Mark Puente. During this session, we will share the background of the CPRE project, detail and discuss the project's timeline, review the framework development process, talk about expected outcomes of the framework, and discuss next steps and how and where you can share your feedback. But first, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the dedicated and tireless work of the Cultural Proficiencies for Racial Equity Task Force, as well as the support of ACRL, ARL, ODLOS, and PLA. I'll now turn it over to Mark Puente.
Hi, good afternoon, I assume, maybe, everyone. Delighted to be here with everyone today. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the origins of this work tell you how it all started. So I did a little checking around on the internet recently, this really conversations about developing this framework happened in early 2019. Really, it came out of conversations that I had with Jody Gray, who was the former director of the Office of Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services at the American Library Association. We had acknowledged, of course, that I was with, at that time, the Association of Research Libraries in Washington, D.C. as the Director of Diversity and Leadership Programs. And both of us had been involved as directors of and leaders of, as well as consumers of many diversity programs, many diversity recruitment programs over the course of our careers. And we had conversations coming out of actually another project, which was an Institute of Museum and Library Services project that was looking at leadership development competencies across libraries, archives, and museums. So there was a project team across LAMS, Libraries, Archives, and Museums, that worked for a couple of years in 2016 and I believe 17 on developing a framework for leadership development competencies, directly working with the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the output of that was a framework, and one that many of us who engage and plan and are involved in leadership development use as a sort of a guiding document as we look at leadership competencies in our respective professional sectors, and in thinking of the knowledge, skills, the abilities, basically the competencies that leaders within our combined professions really need. So we had an informal conversation. I believe this was ALA in June of 2019 during the annual ALA conference, and we convened the executive directors of ARL, ACRL, and PLA. ALA was in a leadership transition at the time, so we didn't have anyone except for Jody, and ODLOS, who was representative of ALA at the time. But there was a lot of enthusiasm for developing this project, and we thought initially about developing an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant to fund the project, but we also recognized at the time that that would have delayed the actual process of developing a framework by at least a year. If you think about the traditional trajectory of developing and applying for an IMLS grant or any kind of external funding. So the group of meta associations basically decided that we would move together, fund our respective organizations would fund the project together, and we would move forward with planning. I mean, why start with racial equity as is a great question. Again, as I mentioned, equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice programs really exist across institutions, across our meta organizations, but racial inequity was really recognized as an area of deep concern. It's one of those areas that can typically, if we, there were several ways to kind of take a look at this, and a very legitimate way is to think very broadly about issues of diversity and inclusion around, issues like accessibility, issues related to LGBTQ plus individuals, and all of those are incredibly important. But we came to the conclusion that and acknowledged the fact that for many of these large-scale, intractable sorts of problems, that proximity to those problems really requires specific focus, and that racial equity, the intentional emphasis on racial equity, was really important for us to move the agenda forward. So the task force at the very beginning, there was a leadership transition with Odlos at ALA. Jody Gray left and Kristen LaHerd took over as the interim director of Odlos, and she and I together fashioned a call for expressions of interest, applications to serve on a task force that we would build over a course of time. As is indicated in the PowerPoint slide here, in the slide deck, we received an overwhelming number of applications from a variety of professional sectors across, across our professional sectors, academic libraries and public libraries in particular. We were very deliberate in ensuring, our attempt was to be very deliberate in ensuring broad representation across the group. We wanted the group to be small enough and agile enough to be able to move quickly through the process, right? And to be able to manage the whole process quickly. But we wanted to ensure that there was broad representation across, ethnicity, race, gender, the professional sector, geography. We wanted to ensure that that issues across the United States and Canada were represented, and we also wanted to ensure that there was representation from those from LIS education, et cetera. So again, very, a huge group of applications were received. It was a very challenging decision. It was really an embarrassment of riches in terms of the people who indicated interest. We were very deliberate in inviting new voices to the process, those maybe, who had not had such a high profile engagement with these types of issues. And so we wanted to ensure that some new perspectives were brought in. And of course, universities, liberal arts colleges across the sector, and including public libraries. Some of those that were selected, one in particular was selected because she was employed at a public library at the time, and then through the process transitioned into a professional role at an academic library. So, so the balance was a little bit disrupted at that time, but still, given her experience of working in the public library realm, she still brought that particular perspective and that added value to the process. So framing the mission, and Christina will talk a bit more about our methodology here, but I don't need to read this for you entirely, but it is to create a foundational resource to help public and academic libraries, and even beyond, people employed in those contexts, to build inclusive cultures for those who are employed within our organizations and with our institutions, but also for the communities that we serve. It's very, very important for us to take both of those perspectives into consideration and to develop a framework that is going to be applicable for all stakeholders. And so it was really important for us to think about both of those angles, and to think about both where the profession exists currently, as a collective, and also where the profession is headed in terms of racial equity. The scope of this was intentional to ensure that we weren't casting too broad of a net, that we weren't getting, our population wasn't too unwieldy, if you will. But at the end of the day, I think it's a fair assessment to say that these the framework that has been developed is really broadly applicable, not only to academic and public libraries, but certainly to school libraries, other cultural heritage organizations as well. Okay, so I just very briefly, we will talk about the process. As you can see, this timeline is rather extended, and obviously the thing that got in the way was COVID, and I'm sure all of us are, we're still reeling from this experience, as well as I mentioned, the sort of racial awakening that happened after the murder of George Floyd. I mean, that was certainly a big part of the work, and how we had to ground the work and sort of reground the work of the group. But we started in January of 2020, and we transitioned immediately. We had every intention of moving to an in-person sort of convening to initiate the work, but because of COVID, our plans were sidetracked, and initiated a series of virtual meetings, working with a facilitator, Catherine Skinner from Educopia in Greensboro, North Carolina. We developed, went through a process of developing a framework that would sort of build on to the broader framework. We had intended to work on that and build that through the fall, through the early summer and into the early fall of 2020. We had to build out and that particular timeline just because of the challenges of both building community, building a sense of trust, and really assessing our individual strengths and the individual competencies that the members of the task force would bring to this process. So we did build that out quite a bit, and so we are at the point right now where the first draft of this, actually it's an iterated draft, a heavily iterated draft, is out for public comment, and Christina will talk about what that looks like and where we're headed from there. Okay, and also it was in a deliberate part of the sort of design of the work that we developed these 4 different working groups that were, that are attendant to this work, not only to the framework, but all of the work of these 4 particular groups really informed the development of the framework. We initially launched a survey development group that produced a survey to get some input in terms of the wide variety of work that has been being done in libraries and archival sectors on racial equity. And those questions included demographics of the participants, what knowledge the participants had on the topic of racial equity, and work climate related to racial equity, etc. Again, it was, we couldn't ignore the elephant in the room, if you will. So questions were incorporated to that are, and some acknowledgement of the effect of COVID-19 and the really worldwide racial awakening that happened that summer. A glossary group obviously helped us work with taxonomies. This was also an iterative process with the framework development group so we recognize that many terms are thought of very differently in different contexts. So we decided to ground the work further by tasking the glossary group to come up with some consensus around some of the key terms that were used within the actual framework, and that informed the definitions of some of the terms that we're using going forward. The data and competencies group was another group that helped to build a data set of existing frameworks. Well, that was our intention, I will say, because we found out through our research that many existing frameworks do not exist. But we researched many entities, both attached to the library and information science profession, and also external to that within the business sector, within higher education, within K-12 education, to help identify the core principles, training curricula, and learning outcomes of organizations and individuals that are engaged in racial equity, for the lack of a better term, training or developmental opportunities. We explored that content across the US and Canada, and built a data set that we are in the process of curating and will be sharing as a sort of complement to the actual racial equity framework that's been developed. And finally, I think.
Right. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework development process. And so we talked about the components that were leading up to the framework development. But each of these working groups laid the foundational groundwork for that framework development working group. And so using the collected data and research gathered, this group was tasked with the drafting of a formalized framework. So we knew early on that the success of this group would directly correlate with the amount of time that we were able to give to consistently meeting. To first define the scope of the framework, and secondly, begin the drafting process. So to that end, we met weekly using a mind mapping process during the early meetings to help us define those concepts and ideas that were critical to the framework. We also understood that this framework had to acknowledge and address the impacts of racism and racial inequity on the LIS profession as a whole, and doing so required a cross-sector approach. So this framework is not a liberatory practice. So we considered the intended impact of the framework in this development process. And while we hope that it will act as a guide for libraries as they endeavor to address racial inequity and racism, we acknowledge that the framework in and of itself is not a liberatory practice. This work requires sustained, ongoing commitment and engagement. And there are no quick fixes, patches, or shortcuts to this process. And we understood that from the very beginning. And introducing the framework. So now I'd like to share with you the 4 frames. The framework is comprised of 4 frames. They are frame 1, which is addressing and interrogating how white supremacy, white privilege, and racism show up in libraries. Frame 2 is accountability, assessment, and implementation. Frame 3 discusses building cross-sector cultural proficiency, influencing and affecting change in professional, civic, and political spheres. And frame 4 has a focus on anti-racist leadership. Within each of these frames, we've developed subsections. And let's talk a little bit more about these frames and how the subsections show up. I first would like to note that you'll see these call out quotes, these pull quotes, they are from the framework itself. And they were selected because they speak a great deal to the intentionality of each of the frames and the work that we were intending to do with the development of the frames. So addressing and interrogating how white supremacy, white privilege, and racism show up in libraries, we have 5 subsections: understanding historical inequities, methodologies for self-assessment, libraries and racial equity, the language of racial equity and white supremacy, and finally, we have the competency continuum. So, in developing that competency continuum, we focused on 4 competencies, and you'll see that this is a original Venn diagram that we created where we discussed manifestations of racism, analysis of racialized outcomes, commitment to countering racism, and awareness of racial identity. And this is what you'll find in our frame 1. Frame 2. Frame 2 is a verbose frame with multiple subsections on focusing on accountability, assessment, and implementation. You will see in this section where we touch on anti-racist objectives and strategies for libraries. We talk about and focus on that important piece of hiring, retention, and advancement, discussions of which in libraries we hear come up time and time again. There's a focus on strategic planning in this section, policies, procedures, and norms, sharing the work and allyship, which we focus on in this section. That piece tied in with accountability and racial equity work. We also focus heavily on power relationships in the field and how they tie back to solidarity and librarianship. So all of these you will see in frame 2 of the developed framework. Frame 3. Frame 3 discusses the building of cross-sector cultural proficiency through the building of relationships in civic, information, and corporate spheres, and how the building of these external relationships impact and influence libraries and racial equity work. This is an important section in that building those cross-sector relationships often can become an untapped resource, particularly when we're thinking about it through an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. And so this section covers that. And finally, frame 4, anti-racist leadership, where we discuss giving focus to the interconnectedness of libraries and the larger institutions of ALA and ARL, specifically focusing on the role of institutions and members in guiding anti-racist leadership practices for the profession. As the saying goes, when your intention is clear, so is the way. And the framework was crafted and drafted with intention to ensure that it would be applicable throughout the LIS profession. We introduced implementation examples for each subheading. And so we felt that it would be important to create a bridge between those subsections and the actual practice and understanding by creating these examples. So you will see them emerge under each subsection. We provide a real-time example so that in reading the framework, it can be practiced. We understood the importance also of amplifying BIPOC LIS workers' voices and LIS workers from academic, public, and research libraries. And so throughout the process, we also have led with the understanding that the framework will not always exist in the current iteration, but it will continually evolve just as racial equity work continues to evolve. So in the framework and in its design has been designed to do many things. It's been designed to support the continued work of ALA's EDISJ committee, ARL's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, ODLOS, and other association-based EDISJ initiatives. It's been designed to support and inform formalized organizational practices. And when we say these formalized organizational practices, we're looking and thinking of those internal EDISJ task forces or committees, maybe those that are currently in practice, or perhaps those that have not yet been formed. To develop and introduce a shared lexicon and language around equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice work. Because as Mark mentioned earlier, with the glossary group, there's so much in terms of terminology, and as it changes, we want to ensure that we were developing a lexicon and language that we'd standardized, and it was very important to us to do so. We wanted to move libraries beyond existing professional silos, encourage opportunities for greater communication, collaboration, conversation, and engagement. And so we talk a bit in the framework about the cross-collaborative, cross-sector approach and utilizing the idea of that turning outward as referenced by the Harwood approach to work, to building coalitions and capacities around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and social justice work. And we wanted to introduce concepts that will impact every touch point associated with library service. So we didn't want for this to be specifically for a particular department or a particular library. We wanted each touch point in the library, every service point, to be able to find applicable resources within the framework that would create a bridge of understanding, with the understanding that we all are impacted by racial inequity. Up next, for us, as in coming soon, are many things within the scope of the framework. We are planning to continue the public comment period through early spring for the framework. We're hoping to finalize the framework. With that being said, we're looking at a timeline that puts us close to ALA annual. We're hoping to seek approval and adoption of the framework from sponsoring organizations and their boards. And Mark, please feel free to jump in here. The framework addresses previous standards, and specifically those 2012 ACRL diversity standards, cultural competency for academic libraries. And as such, it also must go through ACRL standards process. So within all the scope of the seeking of approvals, we also have considered that. And finally, and this is a very exciting, ARL DEI Institute, which is supported by an IMLS grant, and the task force includes ACRL and ODLOS. So part of this work includes exploring ways to translate the CPRE framework into education and action for individuals working in memory and information organizations and institutions. So this is just a few of the ways that we are anticipating that the framework will be utilized once it is finalized and approved, and some of the things we're hoping for in terms of finalizing the framework. But of critical importance to us is receiving your feedback. You can share your feedback in two ways. First, you can visit our HTTPS site, acrl.all.org, /racial equity framework / or. Here we have now, if you have a device and you can scan this QR code right now on your screen, it will lead you directly to our Common Press site. Your feedback is critically important to ensuring that the framework is reflective and covers all the areas that need to be covered. And it is extremely important to have all voices contribute to this process. All right, so with that being said, we want to take your questions. So we wanted to give you enough time to be able to ask any questions that you may have. So please do, if you have questions or concerns, additional information you want to know about the framework, you may contact any of your points of contact here via ACRL, ARL, ODLOS, or PLA. Their information is here. And once again, we have our code here, our QR code for you to scan so that you can engage further with the Common Press site by giving us your feedback, registering, and giving us that extremely valuable feedback that we need for the framework.
Thank you, Christina, and just emphasizing that the comments will be collected through 5 p.m. Central Standard Time on March 2nd, which is a Wednesday. So that's when the comment period will close.
Mark. And as we're here, we're happy to answer any specific questions that you have about the framework as it stands. Yes, we will share those slides. We're happy to share out the slides with you post-session. Yes. Yes, if you would just leave any questions you have in our via chat.